So it's a two-way flow. Also, the idea that because a country has very close relations with the US, it cannot have close relations with Asia is silly. It makes no sense. I would argue that countries that have strong relations with the US are in a much more influential position to then go out and play their own strategic role in Asia. It's not like there's a zero-sum choice.
Yeah, but it would be hard for Thailand and the Philippines to argue for that.
Well, Japan, Korea, and Australia, in the past year or two,
Top-rate airlines.
well, they have all tried to maintain a balance between the US and China. China abused that. China pushed them. And they have all come strategically. Economic ties with China continue to be strong, but in strategic terms, all of those big treaty allies, Japan, Korea, Australia, the bigger ones, have all moved closer to the US and showed that to China. So when China pushes, the bigger treaty allies say push back. How do they push back? Partly by showing to the Chinese how strong alliance is with the US. Thailand and the Philippines, even though Thailand of course is our oldest relationship in Asia, these are countries that are not as big and not as powerful as Japan or Korea or Australia. I think probably worry a little bit more about whether China will abuse them. And also, I sometimes wonder if Thai foreign policy is strategic enough. For example, if you do exercises with the PLA on counterterrorism to show your pique or your frustration with the Pentagon in Washington over arms sales, is that strategic?
Yeah.
That's a kind of a tactical game.
Yeah.
When you flip-flop and play that game, it will tempt a big power like China to think Thailand can be pushed and manipulated.
Around, yeah.
And I think, I'm engaging in interference in internal affairs, but I think it's much better strategy for a middle power like Thailand to be consistent in its relationship with the US, so that Beijing doesn't think it can push. And then with that as a kind of a base or a backdrop, Thailand can explore much broader, much closer cooperation with China on a variety of fronts. The United States will never say to Thailand, don't have good relations with China because you're a treaty ally. It's not US strategy, it's not US policy. But if you play this game back and forth, that tempts the big powers to think they can manipulate a smaller power even more. So it's something of a dangerous game.
You are currently completing a book on history of American diplomacy, especially toward Asia. Can you tell us a little bit more, in the past 2 centuries, what is the salient points or characters of American diplomacy?
Well, the book is actually a book about American strategy in Asia. And I distinguish that from diplomacy because diplomacy is transactional. Diplomacy is maintaining relations, negotiating trade agreements, negotiating peace treaties. It's transactional. There's strategy to it. It can be very transactional. I'm interested in what were the strategic concepts that drove America's engagement of Asia. What did American leaders think were the big opportunities and the big challenges? What did Americans think were the tools of American power? And what I'm finding is, from the very beginning, from 1784, from the birth of our republic, Americans who thought about Asia, and of course in those days, the continental United States stopped at the Allegheny Mountains. Nobody knew if you could get across the US by water. We knew a little bit about Oregon Territory, we knew a little bit about Hawaii, because some sailors had gone on British ships. But George Washington, our first president, thought that people in China were white. We didn't know anything. And yet somehow there was a concept that there were 3 things we had to do as we moved westward across the continental North American landscape and out towards Hawaii and then out to the Pacific, engaging this region. And one was that we thought about our role in terms of power. We didn't want other big powers pushing us. So as we expanded west across what is now the United States, part of that was to push back the French, the British, the Spanish, so that we wouldn't be pressed and so that we would have room for our own development. And then as we got to the Pacific, President Tyler in the 1820s declared the Tyler Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine is famous in the Caribbean. Tyler declared the Tyler Doctrine, which said no other European power, not France, not Britain, should dominate Hawaii, the Sandwich Islands, the US will. When faced with rising powers or other challenges, we tend to strengthen our position. The second thing is trade. We've always, from the beginning, believed that American influence depends on trade. And then the third one is our values. You know, Thomas Jefferson, when he was Secretary of State, thought that someday what is today Oregon and Washington State, that these would be under American dominance, but not colonies. because he said America was a colony, we were colonies, we don't make colonies. So we should have independent republics, democratic states that would be our friends and increase our influence. That was more than 200 years ago, thinking about the Pacific coast of the U.S. And if you look at American foreign policy in Asia, there's a repeating argument strategically that if countries in this region are democratic, are independent, have strong institutions, then they won't be colonized by Germany or Britain or Japan or China or Russia or any other country, and that they will naturally be friends with the United States. So the idea that democracy is important is not just a moral question. For 200 years, it's been a strategic question. It's been about influence, frankly. So I've looked at how these different tools have been used and at all the mistakes that the U.S. has made, but basically conclude the U.S. has had and America has had some strategic view of Asia that's evolved over time. And that as China rises, we will continue to draw on some of those same tools.
So under which presidency that has the best practice policy toward China?
Before the Second World War, the presidency of Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt understood that Asia was the future. He was influenced by Alfred Thayer Mahan, the first really great American strategic writer. And Mahan said someday, in 1900, Mahan said someday China will rise, India will rise, Asia will be the center of global power. His argument was that to maintain American position in Asia, we needed strong relations with the maritime powers, Japan, Britain, which meant Australia. Thailand's an interesting case. It was our first treaty, but is Thailand a continental power or a maritime power? Basically, it's a continental power. So,
yes.
So in an American foreign policy that's often focused on maritime powers, Thailand is a somewhat unique, long-standing treaty ally that's continental. Southeast Asia, but continental. Anyway, Theodore Roosevelt had the most strategic idea of how to maintain balance of power and American influence. He tried to accommodate rising Japan, encourage Japan to move towards more democratic institutions, but he built up the U.S. Navy as a balance. In the post-war period, I think the best, maybe Nixon. Nixon has the biggest success and the biggest failure. Biggest success was opening to China. No president since World War II has done such a huge strategic thing. But he also had big failures. The way the Vietnam War ended, the so-called Nixon Doctrine, where he said that we would now let Asian allies defend themselves. It was a shock in Thailand, in Korea, and Japan. It badly hurt U.S. interests. No president has been perfect, but those are probably the two best in terms of strategic thinking, Theodore Roosevelt, Richard Nixon.
So when you compare with the current policy toward Asia, then can you describe Obama Asia policy is more pragmatic, much more balanced then?
I think Obama's Asia policy is very unoriginal, which is good.
Have many precedent, you mean?
Yeah, it's very unoriginal. It's basically continuing what Clinton and Bush did, which is to engage China, try to strengthen transparency, mutual trust, cooperation, try to expand the areas of cooperation to include climate change and other things, but balancing and hedging. And as I said, Clinton did it with Japan first, Bush did it with Japan and India. Obama's now trying to strengthen U.S. ties more with ASEAN. That is a very classic American strategic approach to Asia. It's not containment, but it's maintaining a strategic balance. Where I would fault Obama, where his weakness is three things that make American strategy in Asia successful when we do them right: strategic balance, trade, and democracy. On trade, Obama has been a little bit uneven. He ran against free trade as a candidate. He ran against the only free trade agreement we had, which was with Korea. He's shifted now, but it's been slow. And on democracy and human rights, his position has been very, very disappointing to many Democratic Party. I'm on the Republican side. I'm an independent, but I worked for Bush, so I'm more on the Republican side. But I think not just Republicans, many Democrats have been disappointed that the Obama administration has taken a more sort of back seat or sort of cautious approach on democracy. And you know, the response to what happened in the Middle East was very slow. You know, in ASEAN, people may be happy that the Obama administration is engaging with the Naypyidaw more. On the other hand, they've gotten almost nothing for this engagement. They look weak and inconsistent. So, you know, a lot of people who care about human rights and democracy in Asia have been a bit disappointed with the Obama administration. You know, I think his view is that after Iraq and after Afghanistan, the U.S. has to work on fixing its own house and be a little more humble about lecturing other countries. And he's probably right. He's probably right. But that's a matter of tone and a matter of style. In terms of substance, I think a lot of people wish he would be more consistent and forthcoming and forward leading on democracy and human rights around the world.
One final question. If you're the president of the United States, there's one single thing you need to do
Shave my beard.
to make sure that U.S. is positioned in Asia in a more sustainable manner. What should U.S. have to do?
One thing, if I could only
Or
choose
several things.
Well, first of all, the U.S. has got to repair its fiscal situation. If we don't get our large debt under control, and that means entitlements, Social Security, those kinds of things. That's very hard to do politically. But if we don't do it, we won't be able to sustain our leadership in the world. So that takes real political courage. I think we also have to maintain, in spite of the growing skepticism among the American people about trade. You know, in polling now, in public opinion polling for the first time, more Americans say trade is bad than good. It's because of the financial crisis. So we need political leadership to convince the American people that trade is good for us, creates jobs, but also it gives us a strong link to the Pacific. The business of America is business, as I think President Coolidge said. If we're not trading and agile and doing free trade agreements, we'll lose our influence and our Asian friends will lose interest in us. So trade is critical. Democracy and human rights, as I mentioned. We don't have to do a lot more, we just have to be a bit more consistent, a bit more steady. The really hard part is how do we deal with China? And there I think we have to consistently maintain our strong alliances, our forward presence. We need to upgrade our military capabilities and our cooperation with allies. And we need to, at the same time, find ways to reassure China. That's difficult because China is quite insecure now. But we need to maintain that strategic balance. But the key to all of these things, to having trade and strong economic relations and an effective military and strategic balance of power, the key is our own economy. And so the debate in the US about the fiscal situation is important for Asia. It may be a little boring and detailed, but it's really quite important for the future of American leadership.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Kavi.
Thank you for joining
Good
our
to see you.
program.
Great to
Thank
be
you.
in Bangkok.
I hope you enjoy our program, our conversation with Dr. Michael Green. I think you have learned a lot about landscape of Asia and the futures of America's strategic interest in this region. Good night. สวัสดีครับ